The purpose of a video game is not only to entertain the player, but to test them. There are many ways to do this, but it usually boils down to two things: solving puzzles and having quick reflexes. But there are some games which have a completely different objective: to mess with your mind. And I'm not just talking about games with overt gore or screen-filling bosses, awesome as those things often are. I'm talking about games that really dig deep into silence and darkness, games that really prioritize atmosphere. Instead of having fully rendered HD graphics, some of the scariest games have primitive visuals and yet manage to leave you in a sweat. If you think about it, it's crazy that a game has the power to freak you out. You know for a fact you're not going to die if you lose, and yet some games are designed so perfectly to unsettle you, they leave you reeling long after you finish playing. So with that in mind, I'm Will for WhatCulture, and here are 10 video games that use your imagination against you. 10. Slender. 8 pages. In this game, you need to locate 8 pages in a murky forest while being hunted by the enigmatic Slender Man. If you take too long or come into contact with the mysterious being, it's game over. Now, that does sound easy enough. Just avoid the suit-wearing Spectre and you should be fine. However, it's not so simple. Since Slender Man wears a black suit, it's difficult to see him, which causes the player to indirectly run straight into him, ending the game. You'd assume he'd be easy to spot because of his white, featureless face. However, players tend to mistake bright objects for Slender Man's head, causing them to panic over nothing. Sure, the game is short, but there's at least one thing everyone agrees on: it's way better than the movie. 9. Clock Tower. In this point-and-click game, you play as Jennifer, an orphan who's adopted by a recluse called Barrows. When Jen explores Barrows' mansion, she learns she's being hunted by Scissorman, a deformed boy armed with garden shears. Every time Scissorman's music plays, you know he's nearby. As soon as you hear the first beat, you look around, trying to figure out where he's coming from. He tends to appear when you least expect it. Often it'll be really weird places to catch you off guard. It's a lesson to never let your guard down, meaning you are constantly on edge. 8. 3D Monster Maze. 3D Monster Maze has a simple but weird premise. You are trapped in a maze with a Tyrannosaurus Rex. You must traverse the labyrinth to find the exit before the dinosaur eats you. That may not sound scary by today's standards, but you must understand that this game was released in 1982. It's one of the first games that can be classified as survival horror. The intro tries to scare the player from the get-go, as it warns that this is not a game for those of a nervous disposition. Despite how primitive the game may seem, 3D Monster Maze manages to actually create a creepy atmosphere. As you run around the maze, you will receive messages stating you can hear footsteps or the T-Rex has seen you. The funny thing is, this game wouldn't be half as fun or terrifying if it wasn't for those texts prompting you on the dinosaur's location. Knowing where the giant lizard is forces you to overthink, making it more likely you'll panic and get lost. It's pretty impressive that a 38-year-old game can still make players anxious from a simple text reading, "Rex is hunting for you." 7. Enemy Zero. Enemy Zero's selling point is simple: the enemies are invisible. You need to gauge the monster's proximity to your character based on how loud they are as they approach you. The game does everything in its power to make you feel vulnerable. Your gun needs to be recharged every single time you fire it, you need to recharge your weapon for a specific length of time or it won't work, and your weapon has a limited range. If you miscalculate how close a monster is by a single step, it's game over. Also, some of the sounds you hear are from the ship, not the monsters. Every time you hear something, you have to decide whether to use your weapon or ignore it, knowing that the wrong decision will get you killed. Because running, turning, and reloading takes such a long time, the player has to decide whether to confront each enemy or try to run away from it. It's a game of constant decision making, and one wrong move is certain death. 6. Resident Evil. The original Resident Evil game can be a frustrating one since the fixed camera angles make it impossible to see round certain corners. When you can hear a zombie shuffling around but can't see it, it drives you crazy since you don't know how close it is. Of course, Capcom did this intentionally to build up as much tension as possible. You can be strolling down a hallway you've passed 10 times, only to be interrupted by a zombified Rottweiler crashing through the window. When things like this happen, you realize that you are never safe, even if you're in an empty room that you've been in dozens of times. Even though the next few sequels were solid entries in the franchise, and the recent Resi 7 does an excellent job of being terrifying, especially in the earlier sequences, it's arguable that the first game is the scariest, since it relies on suspense and a haunting atmosphere rather than battles with monsters. 5. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is one of the first games described as nightmare fuel. Considering the story deals with sadism, genocide, and insanity, that shouldn't be surprising. The game takes place in the future after a supercomputer called Am decides to wipe out humanity. Am's hatred for mankind is so potent, it spares 5 humans and makes them immortal so it can torture them forever. The most chilling aspects of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is not what's shown, but what's implied. Each human's punishment is designed to parallel his or her scenes. Although Am tortures his prisoners by describing the agonies they'll endure, most of the game's violent moments actually happen off-screen. However, this makes the game more disturbing since your imagination pictures images far worse than anything that can be put on screen. It just goes to show that there is nothing more effective than the human imagination. 4. Undertale. At the end of your first playthrough of Undertale, you'll most likely have to defeat the sadistic psychopath, Flowey the Flower. Flowey is so overpowerful, he'll probably kill the player within seconds upon your first playthrough. Upon your death, the screen reads, "Game over." This is where the game confuses the hell out of you. Flowey will reset your save file to the point before you died, allowing you to try again. This seems like a nice gesture, until Flowey admits he's resurrecting you because he wants to kill you again, and again, and again. Despite the fact that Undertale follows a turn-based style, Flowey throws the rules out of the window during this battle, so you have no idea how to fight him. Also, if you dodge his insane attacks, he can reset your save file, placing you in front of his projectiles. But that's not the only way Flowey can screw with your save. When the player learns that sparing enemies changes how the game unfolds, some players open an old save file to try and play the game without taking a life. If you encounter Flowey after doing this, he will remind you who you killed in your original save, just to mess with your mind. 3. Silent Hill. After the success of Resident Evil, Capcom decided to make another horror series which focused on atmosphere and suspense rather than monsters and jump scares. Now don't get me wrong, Silent Hill has plenty of monsters which resemble nightmare fuel on steroids. However, the real horror in the series is never in your face. What makes the franchise so scary is its ability to crawl under the player's skin. The claustrophobic environment and haunting score unnerves the player, keeping them on edge. Although the fog was inserted to stop the gameplay from lagging, many players found it unsettling since they couldn't tell how far or close enemies were. When you hear nails scraping inside a locker or a baby crying in the distance, the player tends to hesitate, asking if they really want to check it out. The reason why these moments are so chilling is because you're expecting something, you just don't know what. And usually, but not always, what you imagine is far more disturbing than what you find. 2. Five Nights at Freddy's. In Five Nights at Freddy's, you play as Mike Schmidt, a night guard of the titular restaurant. Within a few seconds, you learn that the building is populated by animal-themed animatronics, who are doing their best to kill you. By checking the security cameras, you need to monitor where the animatronics are in order to survive. Even as an indie game, the objective of Five Nights at Freddy's couldn't be simpler. Each night, you need to survive 6 hours before the animatronics reach your room. If they get too close, you need to close one of the doors. Because you have limited power, you need to gauge when to close the door and for how long, but you don't know when you're safe unless you check the cameras, which uses power. So the best way to conserve power is to avoid looking at the cameras, which means you won't know if the animatronics are approaching. If you don't check the cameras, you don't know if they're in their rooms or 2 seconds away from killing you. The scariest thing about this game isn't the animatronics, it's the overthinking. 1. Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem. Eternal Darkness begins with Alexandra returning to her family's estate after her grandfather is murdered. Unearthing clues around his home, she learns that her grandfather's death is connected to a cosmic entity who intends to consume the world. Throughout the game, the player controls 12 characters from 12 time periods who have encountered this ancient evil. In your adventures, you encounter demons, ghosts, zombies, monsters, and gods. However, the greatest obstacle in the game is yourself. You see, Eternal Darkness is the first game to have a sanity meter. Every time you have a paranormal encounter, the sanity meter depletes. If it drops too low, you'll start to hallucinate. These hallucinations can be so subtle, they'll actually fool you, the person who's playing. The depleted sanity meter can make you hear children screaming or give the impression that bugs are passing by the screen. The moment that tends to really really freak out players the most is when Alexandra has to inspect a bathtub only to see her own corpse inside covered in blood. And there you have it, folks, 10 video games that use your imagination against you. Feel free to drop this video a like if you enjoyed it, and drop me a follow on Twitter at @USlyDowU. I'm Will for WhatCulture, thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you next time.